Welcome back to Sleepy Chronicles. Tonight, we're asking why medieval life might have carried less stress than the one you're living right now. Lie back and get comfortable. If you enjoy quiet voices and slow history, take a moment to like and subscribe. It costs nothing and means a lot. Let us know where you're listening from tonight. We'll take it from here. Assume for a moment that medieval life was simply a worse version of modern life, missing every comfort we now rely on, and you'd only be half right. It was missing plenty, but it was also missing something that quietly exhausts modern minds, an endless wall of choices, cold air slipping through a shutter that never quite closed all the way, the smell of last night's fire, banked low but not dead, boots pulled on over feet still stiff with sleep, laces tied by feel in the dark. Somewhere outside, an animal already awake and unhappy about having to wait. A villager's morning arrived already decided. The animals needed feeding whether anyone felt inspired or not. The fields needed walking whether the weather cooperated or not. Nobody sat down with a cup of something warm to weigh their options, because there weren't any options to weigh. Bread existed, or it didn't. The well worked, or it needed fixing. That was usually the extent of the decision-making before noon. Now picture the alternative that fills a modern morning instead. 3 streaming platforms arguing for attention. A pantry of near-identical cereal boxes, each insisting it alone understands a buyer's nutritional needs. An inbox demanding a font be chosen for a slide nobody will remember by Thursday. None of it is urgent. All of it is exhausting anyway, because a mind built for a handful of daily decisions is now asked to make hundreds before lunch is even considered. A medieval household answered to exactly one bakery, and the only outcome that mattered was whether it had loaves left that morning. There was nothing to compare, nothing to research, nothing left abandoned in a cart at midnight out of sheer indecision. One bakery, one answer, decision closed. That smallness stretched well past the kitchen. The village itself was usually the edge of most people's known universe. A market town sat a day's walk beyond the fields. Somewhere further out, impossibly far, there was a city people spoke of the way sailors once spoke of sea monsters. Real, presumably, though nobody local had actually laid eyes on it. A lifetime could pass entirely inside that narrow radius, and often did. That could sound like a cage, it rarely felt like one. And here's the thing that changes everything. Comparisons stayed local too, and locality changes how a mind carries stress. Nobody's ambition had to compete with a continent. Nobody woke wondering whether a stranger 3 countries away had already achieved more before breakfast. A farmer measured his herd against the herd 2 fields over, not against thousands of strangers glowing on a screen somewhere unreachable. A neighbor's freshly thatched roof carried no mystery at all. The whole village had watched the work happen, plank by plank, across 3 long autumns, so the result felt earned rather than resented. Achievement made sense when everyone present had seen the effort behind it. Today, the brain is asked to process thousands of strangers before breakfast finishes. Vacations nobody took. Promotions nobody got. Mornings that supposedly begin with sunrise routines and end in somebody else's version of a perfect life. Almost none of it is verifiable in any meaningful sense, and yet the nervous system reacts as though it happened next door. It never evolved to sort truth from performance at that scale. For nearly all of human history, a person's entire social world numbered in the hundreds, not the millions. Imagine how quiet that must have felt. Not empty, just quiet. A world sized to what one mind could actually hold, where a stranger's fortune 3 counties away simply wasn't anyone's business, because word of it would likely never even arrive. Smaller world, fewer strangers to lose to. Of course, medieval villagers still had plenty to worry about: bad harvests, sudden sickness, the occasional wandering pig, starting a diplomatic incident between 2 farms. All of that is coming. But the sheer mental noise of modern comparison, the 100 invisible competitions already running before coffee, that particular exhaustion simply hadn't been invented yet. The world hadn't been built large enough yet to hold it. If a fixed daily rhythm sounds like a trap to modern ears, medieval life would have argued the opposite. Routine wasn't a cage back then. It was the thing that kept the mind quiet. Nobody in a medieval village woke up wondering what today's schedule should look like. The sky already knew. Spring meant planting. Summer meant tending. Autumn meant the harvest, and everyone dropped whatever else they were doing to bring it in before the weather turned. Winter meant mending tools and patching clothes, fingers gone stiff as the wind found every gap in the walls. Every season arrived with its own instructions already attached, and nobody had to write them down. Dawn functioned as the only alarm anyone needed, and dusk as the only notice to stop. There was no arguing with fading light. It simply ended the workday, whether the harvest was finished or not. Nature ran the schedule, not an inbox. Whoever owned the land could demand plenty during daylight hours, but even a demanding lord had no way of reaching anyone once the sun went down. Compare that to a modern evening interrupted by a calendar app reminding someone they're already behind, or a message marked urgent landing at 9 at night from 3 time zones away. Imagine an evening where the setting sun itself closed the workday. No follow-up possible until sunrise, no matter how demanding the person giving orders happened to be. The workday now has no natural edge to it. It simply keeps going until a person forces it to stop. And forcing it to stop takes energy that dusk once provided automatically, every single day, for free. Needle pulled through worn wool, a stitch, then another thread biting at fingers gone stiff with cold. Wind worrying at a loose shutter, finding every gap between the boards. A dog curled tight against a leg for warmth, the two of them barely moving. Outside, the dark arriving early, and nobody minding it much. That predictability did something modern psychology takes seriously. A mind that already knows what tomorrow requires spends less energy bracing for it. Medieval villagers weren't practicing a wellness technique. They simply lived inside one without ever naming it. Nature set the hours. Nobody argued with a sunset. A second kind of certainty ran deeper than the calendar, and it had to do with who a person was expected to become. A future already decided might sound unbearable to modern ears until you notice what it removed. Nearly nobody spent their 20s agonizing over which version of themselves was the correct one. A child raised by a miller usually learned milling. A daughter raised by a weaver usually learned weaving. By the teenage years, a working life's shape was already visible, inherited rather than chosen from an overwhelming menu of careers and passions. That closed doors, certainly. A gifted apprentice might rise, and occasionally a clever child found a path into the church or a trade far from home. But for most people, the outline of a life was sketched early and filled in gradually. What that arrangement quietly removed was the modern habit of treating identity as something to construct, market, and constantly revise. Who a person was had far less to do with achievement, and far more to do with who already claimed them. Somebody's daughter, somebody's neighbor, somebody's apprentice, known by name and reputation long before anyone asked what they were passionate about. Certainty had a quieter cousin, one that rarely gets credit. Nobody carried their hardest days alone. A bad harvest, a sick child, a rough week, the whole village usually knew by morning. Not because privacy didn't exist, but because isolation barely did either. What sounds today like a loss of privacy functioned, at the time, as an early kind of safety net. Trouble rarely stayed a private burden for long, because somebody nearby already knew and already expected to help. Nobody was reinventing themselves every few years, chasing a new city, a new title, a new curated version of who they were supposed to become. Consistency earned more respect than novelty ever did. A dependable tanner mattered more to a village than an ambitious one chasing something better elsewhere. Known, rooted, and rarely alone with a problem. None of this made medieval life easy. Plenty longed for a future beyond the one sketched out for them, and plenty never got it. But the mind spends less effort defending an identity it never had to invent, and a village that already knows your name tends to notice, quietly, when something has gone wrong. Ask what a medieval villager wore on a random morning, and the answer disappoints anyone expecting drama. There wasn't a decision to make. There was a peg by the door, and whatever hung on it. Most ordinary households owned a small handful of garments. A linen shirt, rough wool for everyday labor, a cloak for the cold months, and one better set reserved for church or a wedding. Open that chest expecting more, and disappointment was guaranteed. There was nothing to weigh, nothing to compare, nothing waiting to be decided. The itchy wool against the skin, the same familiar sleeves rolled up before sunrise. Comfort came from sameness, not variety. Food followed the same quiet logic. Nobody compared 4 different cuisines before settling on dinner, because dinner had already been decided by the season, and whatever the local animals and fields happened to provide that week. Bread came from available grain. Cheese came from a neighbor's cow. Meat showed up occasionally, treated as an event rather than an entitlement. A meal wasn't a decision. It was simply what the pot contained. Compare that to a modern evening spent scrolling through delivery apps. reading reviews for 3 different restaurants, and somehow still ending up disappointed with whatever eventually arrives. More options were supposed to bring more satisfaction. Psychologists now describe the opposite effect and give it a name: the paradox of choice. Past a certain point, additional options don't create freedom. They create doubt, and doubt is exhausting in a way that scarcity never was. Morning arrived the same way it always did. Rough wool pulled over the shoulders, still faintly damp from last night's rain. A belt cinched by feel, no mirror needed, no mirror owned. The same sleeves rolled back at the same point every morning. Outside, smoke rising thin and straight from a dozen other chimneys, all of them starting the exact same way. That same simplicity extended to the rare moments that called for something better. Fashion existed, plenty of it, but it lived almost entirely among nobles and merchants who could afford dye, and imported cloth loud enough to announce their wealth from across a room. For nearly everyone else, practicality simply won by default every single day, without a single debate about it. One peg, one outfit, whatever the pot held that night. A second kind of stress relief ran even quieter than clothing or food, and it had to do with how unexplained hardship was handled. Assume for a moment that medieval people simply had fewer things to worry about than modern ones. That assumption falls apart quickly. What they actually had was something else, an explanation ready and waiting whenever life refused to make sense. Religion filled that role for most of medieval Europe. It wasn't reserved for a single day of the week. It was the framework holding everything else together. A poor harvest, a sudden illness, an unusually harsh winter. All of it fit somewhere inside a larger story that had been told since childhood. The specific answer mattered less than the fact that an answer existed at all. Modern psychology keeps circling back to a related discovery. Uncertainty, not hardship itself, tends to drive people toward anxiety. A problem with a known cause is difficult. A problem with no cause at all, one that could strike again from any direction without warning, is what actually keeps a mind awake at night. Imagine facing a failed crop or a feverish child with no way to search, no forum full of strangers' opinions, nothing but a story old enough to have carried entire generations through the same fear already. That story didn't need to be provable to be useful. just needed to hold. Today, an unexplained symptom sends most people straight to a search engine, scrolling through a widening list of frightening possibilities until a minor headache has somehow become several imagined emergencies at once. A medieval mind, faced with the same uncertainty, reached for meaning instead of more information. Whether that meaning held up to modern scrutiny mattered far less than what it did for the nervous system in the moment. It gave the mind somewhere to rest instead of somewhere to spiral. Church bells marked the hours regardless of what the day had brought. Weekly gatherings pulled the whole village back together, no matter how difficult the previous week had been. None of it made hardship disappear. It simply kept hardship from feeling random. And random, it turns out, is the part that costs you the most sleep. An explanation, however imperfect, beats an open question every time the sun goes down. Assume medieval villagers had no interest in fitness, and you'd be describing a concept that simply hadn't been invented yet. Not because nobody cared about the body, but because the body was already working hard enough that inventing a separate word for it would have sounded absurd. Physical effort wasn't scheduled into the day. It was the day. Hauling water, lifting sacks of grain, climbing to a roof that needed patching, walking to a field and back. These weren't tasks squeezed in around real life. They were real life, distributed across dawn to dusk, without anyone ever calling it a workout. Hands grew calloused from rope and tool handles rather than from gripping anything at a gym. And legs ached from actual distance, covered, not from a machine pretending distance was being covered. Picture the modern alternative. A room full of machines built specifically so a body can walk without actually going anywhere. In front of a screen showing footage of somebody else walking through an actual forest. A medieval mind encountering that scene would probably need it explained twice, and even then would likely conclude the explanation had gotten lost somewhere in translation. Leisure time carried the same logic. Evenings and feast days brought wrestling matches, archery, running games across open fields, dice, and board games passed hand to hand as the evening wore on. Nobody stood still long enough for stillness to become the norm worth escaping from later. Fitness wasn't a goal chased in spare hours. It was simply what a body did by default. The way breathing is what lungs do by default. Strength wasn't admired as a personal achievement either. It was just expected, the same way everyone expected the sun to rise. Nothing to post about, nothing to measure against a neighbor's progress photos. Underneath all of it, the same basic labor kept going, day after day. Rope biting into palms, hauling a bucket up from the well. A dull ache settling into shoulders by midday, familiar as breathing. Boots caked with the same mud they were caked with yesterday. A dog trotting alongside without being asked, the way it always did. No steps counted, no rings closed, just work and games that happened to double as work for the muscles without anyone naming it that way. Attention worked on a similar rhythm, and it had a beginning, a middle. And this is the part modern life quietly lost, an actual end. A storyteller finished a tale and stopped talking. Musicians packed their instruments away, and that meant the music was genuinely over, not paused, not cued into something else designed to keep ears occupied a little longer. Songs got passed down the same way stories did, learned by ear, repeated until everyone in the room already half knew the next line. When the evening wound down and neighbors said their good nights, there was nothing left demanding attention. Minds that had been pleasantly entertained for an hour were simply allowed to sit there, unstimulated, doing nothing in particular. Modern psychology has since circled back to something medieval evenings offered by accident. Boredom isn't a malfunction to eliminate. It's a pause the brain actually needs in order to recover. The mental equivalent of a field left fallow for a season before it's asked to grow anything again. Compare that to an evening where finishing one show quietly triggers a countdown into the next one, where scrolling replaces the moment a storyteller would have simply stopped talking. Nothing modern ever really ends anymore. It just keeps auto-playing until somebody consciously fights their way out of it. And fighting takes energy that darkness once provided automatically, free of charge, every single night. Sleep followed the same natural handoff. Without artificial light stretching the evening indefinitely, most people grew tired soon after dark and drifted off accordingly. Historians studying the period believe many households practiced what's now called segmented sleep, a stretch of rest, a quiet waking window somewhere in the middle of the night, often used for a bit of prayer or simply letting the mind settle, and then sleep again until morning light returned. If you'd woken during that quiet middle stretch, nobody would have reached for a phone to check the time or scroll away the restlessness. The dark itself was reason enough to lie still and wait. Whether or not that pattern held everywhere, bodies stayed tuned to sunlight and darkness rather than to a screen's glow, deciding when the day was finally allowed to end. The story ended, the evening quieted, and whatever tomorrow held could wait calmly until the sun said otherwise. Assume the 4 evenings so far have painted medieval life as one long, gentle routine, and an important piece has been left out. Most of the year did move that way, familiar, predictable, quiet. But every so often, the ground shifted without warning, and when it did, it shifted hard. Picture a summer nearly finished, wheat standing tall and almost ready, weeks of careful work about to pay off. Then the clouds gather and stay. Not an afternoon of rain, but days of it, until the fields turn to mud and the grain starts rotting where it stands. A ruined harvest didn't just disappoint a household. It could threaten an entire village through the following winter. Disease worked the same way, arriving rather than merely being feared. A fever moving through a village wasn't a headline glimpsed and scrolled past. It was the house 2 doors down going quiet, and the bell ringing more often than usual. Nobody understood the cause. Remedies leaned on guesswork and hope, which turned out to be a difficult thing to prescribe. War added its own layer, even for households that never saw a battle. Fields got trampled, and refugees arrived carrying stories from days away, close enough to make a quiet corner of the world feel suddenly unsafe. Compare that to a slow internet connection, an order arriving wrong, or a package running 1 day late, spiraling into a full-blown bad mood, as though the brain were bracing to defend a castle under siege. Without any real catastrophe to measure against, small frustrations start acting like large ones. A medieval villager, hearing about a delayed package treated as a crisis, might have paused, genuinely puzzled, and asked only one honest question: is everyone still alive? And yet, once a crisis passed, ordinary life came back fast. Fields still needed planting. Markets reopened. Bells that had tolled for illness eventually rang for a wedding instead, and people returned to routine, almost as if daring it to disappear again. Peace wasn't taken for granted, precisely because everyone understood exactly how easily it could vanish. Storms passed. Bells changed their tune. Life picked itself back up because it always had to. There's another thread running beneath everything these evenings have covered, and it isn't nostalgia. Assume a slower, dimmer, more repetitive life was simply worse across the board, missing anything modern research would take seriously, and the assumption falls apart almost immediately. Researchers studying what calms an anxious mind keep landing on the same short list. Predictable routines reduce mental fatigue, since a brain that already knows what's coming spends less energy bracing for it. Regular movement lowers anxiety, whether or not anyone calls it exercise. Close, dependable relationships remain one of the strongest predictors of long-term well-being. Natural light regulates sleep more reliably than any screen. Meaning making reduces the exhaustion that pure, unexplained uncertainty tends to cause. Imagine hearing that whole list read aloud in a lecture hall, and realizing it sounds less like a breakthrough and more like a description of an ordinary medieval week, a shared loaf passed hand to hand around a table too small for everyone at it. Laughter over a story already heard a dozen times before. A neighbor's hand steadying a wobbling stool without being asked. The fire holding just enough light to still see every face in the room. None of that was designed on purpose. It was simply how villages worked, season after season, generation after generation, long before anyone needed to write it down as advice. One small habit tied every evening together without anyone noticing. When the light faded, a fire was allowed to burn low, and a household let the day close instead of forcing it to continue. Someone banked the coals for morning. Someone let the room go dim. It happened in one house, then the next, then every house down the lane, night after night, passed forward without a single person deciding to start a tradition. It simply became one, quietly inherited by every generation that followed, including, in its own way, this one. That's really the whole idea, carried across 4 evenings and settling here in the 5th. A slower rhythm, a smaller world, work that already had its own ending built in, and evenings allowed to actually finish instead of stretching on forever. None of it required effort. It simply required letting the day be done. So let the room around you do the same thing now. Let your shoulders drop from wherever they've been holding on. There's nothing left to decide tonight, no choice to weigh, no message to answer. nothing waiting to be figured out before morning. Somewhere behind your eyes, let the light go the way a fire goes when nobody adds another log. Not all at once, just quietly dimmer, and then dimmer again. Your breathing can slow on its own, the way breathing has always known how to do, long before anyone needed to be reminded. The day is finished. It doesn't need anything else from you. Let it close, gently, the way it always has, in one house after another, for longer than anyone can count. And let yourself drift, unhurried, into whatever comes next. Sleep well. We'll be here again next time.